Hi, everybody.
Hi. We have 60 people watching.
60 people on the Zoom.
Yes.
And Boaz is back. Okay, Boaz. It's all your platform.
This is only on the Zoom. Basically, we send everybody another link to watch, which is not an interactive link. It's only we chat, and I'll pass on the request, question, whatever people will ask in the other broadcast. Okay, go ahead, Tal.
Tal is muted.
I'm mute now. Okay, can you hear me now, everyone?
You can.
Yes.
All right, hello from New York City. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this final session of the day. You're watching, or you're rather listening, I should say, to the 7th Freedom Convention of Israel's Freedom Movement. We have many people tuning in from Israel today. Keep it in mind, dear speakers, and also from the United States. So just know that we will talk about how both countries are dealing with the pandemic. And in this next conversation, we will break down different aspects of the corona crisis worldwide and its political and economic implications. We will compare between strategies to fight the pandemic and also stabilize the economy. And we will explore why is economic freedom important in dealing with coronavirus as we compare also between different health systems around the world. And we have the best panels to do so. We decided to divide our panel to 2 different sessions. My name is Tal Heinrich. I'm an Israeli journalist located in New York City, the epicenter of the coronavirus right now around the world. And I'm joined by our very dignified guests. We will start this first hour with Dr. Yaron Brook. He's the host of the Yaron Brook Show podcast and the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute. We're also joined by Fleming Rose, a Danish journalist. I think you should mute yourself, guys. All right, and Fleming Rose, he's a Danish journalist and senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Now, the second hour, we will be joined by Ветом. I just want to preview this right now. He's an investor and founder of the capitalistic hedge fund and a contributor for Fox Business. Tom Pallmer will be joining us as well. He's a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and vice president for international programs at the Atlas Network. Now, as Boaz mentioned before, and I would like to mention it again, we encourage your engagement, and so before we begin, you can submit your questions. I just want to mention this during the discussion. Boaz will send me via WhatsApp your questions, and we will try to address them as we go. You can send them in Hebrew or rather in English. That's preferred. So great to have you here, everyone. Yaron is the most veteran participant, I think, of this conference among our panelists. I think we will start with you. We'll kick it off with you.
Are you calling me old? Is that what you do?
No. Just in our conference, I mean. I think it's the 7th Freedom Movement, Freedom Convention, and you've been there from the very beginning, right?
I think I've done 3 or 4. I can't remember, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure I was there at the first one, but I've been here. I've been to several of them.
So you know, we're all stuck in our homes, and we feel the crisis every day, every hour. Tell us, what is your assessment of how bad things are for the U.S. and for Israel? You know, we know in what shape we entered this crisis, but the question is, in what shape are we going to get out of it? And I'm asking because I saw someone on your podcast last week. They asked you if the U.S. is going to come out of it being Venezuela.
So no, I don't think we're going to come out of it being Venezuela. It takes decades of corrupt and socialist and really horrific statist policies to get to the condition of Venezuela. But look, part of the great tragedy of what we're experiencing right now, and part of the great fail, which is government policy all over the world, is that we don't have a good assessment of how we're doing right now. That is, the data is not available. There is a real shortage of data because of shortage of testing, because the fact that we're not getting, you know, the kind of sophisticated data we should be getting at this point. And the massive fail in the United States to test. The U.S. for months sat on its hands and did nothing. Bureaucratic red tape restricted the ability of private companies, private laboratories, even university laboratories and hospital laboratories to actually engage in testing. We should be today in a position where millions of people are being tested, and we have a clear picture of how many people are infected, how many are not, how many people in ICU, how many people do we expect to go to ICU. We don't know. I mean, everybody's talking about this peak demand at hospitals. Nobody has a clear idea. We've got models, but the models are not based on real data, and they should be. There's no excuse for this failure. So it's hard to tell. You know, as you know, in New York is hit hard. But hit hard means that the 1,300, 1,400 deaths. We don't know how many people are infected. We know how many people have tested positive, but we have no clue how many people have been affected because most people have not been tested. So we don't really know if 1,300 is a lot or little, if the death rate is high or if the death rate is low. We are flying blind here when there's no excuse to be flying blind. In terms of economics, there's no question we're taking a massive hit in the United States and I think in much of the Western world. The fact that our politicians have basically shut down our economies is unbelievably painful, and unbelievably painful mostly for small business owners, for people who work for small businesses or people who work generally, the working class. It is particularly harmful to people who don't have a lot of savings in the bank. So there is real pain out there. That doesn't turn the United States into Venezuela. It doesn't turn the United States into a poor country. We're still a very, very wealthy country. We still have immense productive capacity. We still have, relatively speaking, flexible markets. We don't have, unfortunately, free markets. We don't have capitalism. Whatever we come out of this, we're going to come out of this weaker than we were. We're going to come out of this struggling. We're going to come out of this poorer, not poor, but poorer. And it's going to be slow. This is not going to be a V-shaped recovery. This is going to be a slow recovery to a large extent because of the way governments are responding. And because we live in a very mixed economy where so much of our economy is command controlled by government or regulated by government in ways that restrict our ability to jumpstart it fast as we come out of this.
Fleming, let's bring you in this conversation. President Trump, he said that he won't allow the cure to be worse than the disease. Now, the biggest challenge for policymakers these days is to try to strike this balance between addressing the spread of the pandemic and, of course, the number of deaths, and also while trying to guarantee the well-being and the welfare of the public. All that, as Viron mentioned, while trying to shape policy decisions around models based on incomplete or even biased data, if we look to China. So given what we know and what we have, let me ask you this. What should be the objective of the administration? What are the priorities in this fight, the way you see it?
Just a few caveats. I'm sitting in Copenhagen and not in Washington, D.C. And therefore, I would be hesitant to appear as an expert on what is going on in the U.S. at the moment. But we have a very interesting situation here in Scandinavia, where you have Denmark, where I'm now. Our social democratic government has enforced rather strict measures. They have closed schools, closed restaurants and cafes, and most people are working from home. And then a few kilometers from where I sit, we have Sweden, which have a very different approach. They have not closed schools. They have kept businesses open. Right now, it seems as if the death rate in Sweden is accelerating compared to Denmark, but it's still within statistical uncertainty. And I agree completely with Viron that the policies that governments are enforcing now are being done without any reliable data. So we really don't know. I mean, if it turns out that Sweden will not suffer more in terms of of people infected and fertility rates, then the US approach and the Danish approach will turn out to be a really disaster, because the price we are paying is very, very high.
Do you think that Sweden will eventually maybe change course like we've seen in the case of the United Kingdom, because of maybe public pressure, because of world pressure?
I mean, they have already corrected their course. For instance, they had a limit of 500 people gathering in public. They have reduced that to 50 people. But in Denmark, it's 2 people, 2 individuals. So they are still ahead of the pack in that sense. But of course, there is a lot of pressure. But the interesting thing about Sweden is that the politicians have left it to the health professionals to make decisions, although there are disagreements and discussions within the health professional community. In Denmark, it's more the politicians and the government who is speaking on this in public and communicating key decisions. But my bigger concern, I mean, I'm not an economist like Viron, but I'm concerned about civil liberties and I mean, across the board, our privacy is being compromised, our freedom of assembly, and our freedom of movement have been curtailed. And of course, there are good reasons. There are at least some reasons for this. We still don't know how good they are, but obviously people are being infected, and there are people who are dying from this disease. But I'm concerned with the speed and the amount of emergency legislation that is being passed, not only in authoritarian regimes, but also in liberal democracies. And we should not forget that it's only 20 years ago we had 9/11, and we had a lot of laws passed in the aftermath of the terrorist attack on the US, the Patriot Act, also limitations on civil liberties. And usually it turns out that governments tend to overreact, and they have to roll back, and it turns out that this saying from Benjamin Franklin, that if you are willing to sacrifice your liberty for security, then you don't deserve either security nor freedom. But we know for a fact that when you limit civil liberties in the name of security, you know that you are getting less freedom, but you are never sure that you will get more security. And that's the kind of situation we are in now, I think.
Tal, can I comment?
Yeah, jump in.
Yeah, first, it's great to be on a panel with Fleming. It's always a pleasure. I agree completely with Fleming. I mean, the scary part of this is that government, whether in the economic realm or the civil liberty realm, is taking on massive powers that, we really haven't had short of like World War II in the United States. And the government is on a war footing without Congress really debating this and declaring a state of emergency, without any kind of checks and balances. There's no mechanism for checks and balances. Governors declare emergency. They shut down whole states, and there's no way for anybody to object, to say, wait a minute, maybe we're overreacting. Maybe there's too much here. The same with civil liberties. And the scary thing about all of this is that we know that once government takes these measures, they almost never roll them completely back. They give you back some of it. They make you feel a little freer after the emergency is passed. But they never take it all back. And as Fleming mentioned, the Patriot Act is still strong and going. If anything, it keeps getting reinforced. We have in the United States still FISA courts, which are secret courts, with no with no questioning, with no ability to really check up on them. And the more the government uses emergency powers, the more the government takes control, the less freedom we're going to have on the other side of this. And you could argue, okay, it's an emergency, they have to do something. I think they're way overreacting, but they have to do something. But every provision of emergency regulation should have a sunset, should have a hard end, should have criteria by which we come out of it, should have a plan. One of the shocking things about all this is not only are they doing it without data, there's no plan. There's no exit strategy. There's no, what is victory, right? What does it mean to defeat this virus? What happens in the fall? What happens in the summer? They're winging it. Everybody is shooting from the hip, winging it, and you get a sense of unthinking, right? The opposite of a scientific approach. This is an approach based on emotion and based on power politics more than anything else.
I want to ask you, wait, Yaron, just here, is fighting the coronavirus just like fighting a foreign enemy, let's say? I mean, do you think it was wise to enact the Defense Production Act, the DPA? General Motors now were ordered to make ventilators, for example. So what should be the threshold to enacting this mechanism in your view?
So I don't know who you are asking, but in my view, they shouldn't be enacting this mechanism ever. I don't think the mechanism should exist. I think the law should be taken off the books. All the government needs to do, let's say they need ventilators. All the government needs to do is take the market price of ventilators, add a 20% premium off of it, and tell the world, we are willing to buy 760,000 ventilators, which is supposedly the deficit in the United States, at market plus 20. I mean, everybody will try to build ventilators to appeal to this demand instead of fighting the market, instead of trying to coerce the market, instead of the government telling GM, you have to do this and this is how to do it. Use the market, provide the right incentives for the market to create the products that you need. Go into the marketplace and say, we'll buy as many masks as you can produce, or we'll buy 1 billion masks at this price. And producers will go out there and try to make as many masks as possible. People will change their production lines to do this in order to make a profit. Use the profit motive. Use the marketplace in order to drive the production of things that are really necessary. And so, no, I don't think the government should view this as a war. It is not a war. I don't think the government should be enacting these special powers to force. I don't think they should do it during a war either, by the way, but I certainly don't think they should be doing it now. Use market incentives to create the products that we need. It's relatively simple to do.
Fleming, give us a sense of how is it being done in your area, in Denmark right now?
Well, there are some differences in Europe. The Netherlands and Sweden seem to be the outliers. Denmark is somewhere in the middle, but in France you have curfew. In Spain, the army has been sent into the streets to control that people are not breaking the new established rules. But come back to what Yaron initiated. I think, unfortunately, that Yaron and I and the other on the panel here, we are in a minority today. And because why can the government get away with things like that? Because if you can frame this question as an issue of life and death, or security or freedom, then unfortunately the vast majority of people will prioritize security, and they are willing to sacrifice freedom. And I think that is what is going on around the world. And the government, if they are able to frame it like they did after 9/11 with these surveillance initiatives, if you can reduce it, why are you talking about privacy? This is a matter of life and death. What do you prefer? To live with the risk or have this surveillance? Unfortunately, the vast majority of people are willing to live with less freedom as soon as the government promise them more security. But I think we should be, very vigilant when the government uses this kind of language, and any government that plays on people's fears. We should be really, really careful to not to not to accept what they are saying. And this boils down to, I think, something about human nature, that we are not born liberal Democrats. We are maybe in favor of our own freedom, but we are not that willing to accept the freedom of others as soon as they use that freedom in a way that we don't like. And that's why every society and every community has to re-educate themselves in exercising these fundamental values like freedom of expression, tolerance, and things like that. It doesn't come as, a fact of nature.
Mm-hmm. Yaron, many countries are looking to the United States to see how the leaders of the free world are handling this crisis. Many headlines these days are reading that President Trump and the White House have lost much valuable time, a 6-week period prior to the outbreak, and have not taken it seriously enough and prepared ahead of time, whether with masks, PPEs, ventilators. How much, Yaron, of what we're seeing now should be blamed, do you think, on the federal government? I mean, talk to us a bit about federal versus local responsibilities.
Oops, you froze there, Tal.
I froze.
I'll answer the question. Mm-hmm. Is everybody frozen?
No, we can hear you.
I hear you.
We can hear. Is Yaron with us? I'm not sure. Fleming, I can see you. I can't see Yaron.
Yes, I can hear you, Tal.
All right. So let's go back. I don't know if you can ask this, if I can ask you the same question, because I'm not sure about, here it's a federal system versus local responsibilities. So there's a lot on the federal government, and also a lot on the governors, and every state around the U.S. has its own policy. Mm-hmm. I think Yaron is maybe going to.
I'm back. Sorry.
Okay.
Zoom dropped me for some reason.
So talk to us about this balance between federal responsibilities and local responsibilities in the U.S. because I think
what's going on.
But we can hear you. Let's try again, or I can continue with Fleming just for the time being until Yaron sorts out the issue. Fleming, how long do you think can this current situation continue? By the way, with a full shutdown. Yaron, are you back?
I think I am.
I think you are.
Mm-hmm.
No, I'm not sure. Fleming, but I can hear you, right?
Yeah, I can hear you, but your voice is muddled somehow. But for how long can this go on?
Yeah, what do you think? Complete shutdown of economies.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the pain you are willing to live with. People have been living in times of long wars with deprivation and all kinds of very unpleasant things. But it's clear that this is a disaster for the economy. And it will take a long time to get back to normalcy, and the more this goes on, and I think that's why you can sense a certain, sense of desperation on behalf of governments around the world, and you have to strike this balance between, getting the economy going, because a disastrous economy will also cost lives. I mean, people losing jobs, families falling apart, all these kind of things. And then being responsible when it comes to physical distancing and the necessity of reining in the virus. It's a balance that every government has to battle with, and I'm pretty sure that not all governments will strike the right balance, and there are governments who will fall because of this, and that's also one of the reasons why I think most governments will do what they have the power to do, and that is basically limiting the freedoms of its citizens.
So a couple questions to you here. Since you are in Denmark and you're an expert on what's happening in Norway and Sweden also right now. And also hearing you can't hear me?
You scrambled.
Tal, it sound like your voice is modeled, yes, and it's look like we lost Viron on the process.
So should we reconnect?
Tal, maybe get out and get back in, and hopefully you will be refreshed and we can continue. I'm now learning that Viron is coming back, and Viron, if you are with us, take the lead till Tal will come back. Okay. Okay, wrong. It was fake news. Viron is not with us yet. Fleming, you are the Lone Ranger now.
But I can. Tom Pallmer is also here, so maybe Tom can join the conversation.
Yeah, let's mix it. We are basically broadcasting from Israel, and we known to be improvisers. So let's bring Tom Pallmer into the conversation. Tom, are you with us?
Wait a second. Let me.
Yes.
Hello to Fleming and Boaz and Corrine and all my friends.
Hello, Tom.
Good to see you.
Good to see you. Shalom.
Shalom indeed. And Tom, can you give us your take on the situation? And Tal, we just came back to us, and we are mixing the session and bringing all the friends we can. Okay. So go ahead.
Let me just introduce Tom. Again, Tom Pallmer is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute and vice president for international programs at the Atlas Network. Tom, great to have you. I know you were listening in throughout the session. So first, your just initial thoughts about what you heard so far.
Well, I think it's very important for us to remember that important principles that have been proven over millennia are not suddenly dissipated or disproven by one crisis. Sometimes extraordinary times do require extraordinary measures. And when we return to normal times, we need to demand the normal rules, which include the things that Fleming talked about: freedom of association, freedom of travel, and so on. I do worry that advocates of liberty can be marginalized from the conversation if they don't acknowledge that these are extraordinary times, which the various participants have done. Some kooks on the very margins have denied that, and I think that they discredit the cause of liberty in doing so. But we need to be absolutely vigilant, because we know how states, how politicians, how governments, how holders of power are. When they get a power, they don't want to give it up. And we have to be completely adamant at the same time that we need to publicly acknowledge extraordinary times mean that mega church meetings in Louisiana are vectors of infection of other people. And so, as painful as it is, I think it's appropriate for authorities to say you can't have 1,800 people meet in a mega church and then go out and spread the disease that way. It's a classic negative externality in economics. But that said, we have to be adamant. We are not granting permanent powers to governments to control us. We don't want the Chinese solution. They are very busy in China promoting how fabulous they have been, and we need to remind people that the authoritarianism of the Chinese Communist Party was one of the problems at the very beginning, by suppressing doctors and punishing them for speaking the truth.
Well, and the data that we have from China, as far as we know, it might mean nothing. I would like to bring in to this conversation Jonathan Honig. He's also joining us, investor, founder of the Capitalist Pig Hedge Fund, and a contributor for Fox Business. Jonathan, great to see you again.
Hi, Tal. I'm delighted to be with you, and I want to thank and congratulate all the sponsors of this really historic and amazing event for pulling this trans-international conference together. I was fortunate enough to speak in Israel at Siri, quiet. The Israeli Freedom Conference about 2 years ago to a large crowd in person, but I think we have an even larger historic crowd here today. So I'm really honored to be, and of course with all the other esteemed panelists as well.
So we were trying to talk to Viron a bit before he sort of faded away somehow. Hopefully we'll get him back soon, about the federal versus local responsibilities during such a crisis. We hear sometimes there's a lot of back and forth between the federal government, the Trump administration, and certain governors, let's say in Michigan, even Andrew Cuomo here in New York, there's some back and forth. Although we do hear that there's a very, bipartisan cooperation. It's not the time for politics, politics aside. But when we try to measure the response, let's say, or say, did the federal government act good enough? Did the governor act good enough in this crisis? What should we be looking at? Who shares the burden for what?
Well, my off-the-cuff comment tells that it's not politics that we should be referring to. Politics isn't the standard. I think Tom said it perfectly just a moment ago. It is principles. Principles are more needed and more vital in a crisis than any time before. My expertise, as you mentioned, I'm a professional investor, and my knowledge is really in terms of, I think, potentially what this has done to the markets and the economy and what it could do. I've actually prepared a short presentation that, with your permission, I'll share with the audience. Let's see if, can everyone see this?
Mm-hmm. Yes, we can.
Okay, great. I'm delighted to be with you. And my big picture here is going to be, don't stimulate markets, free them. And it kind of speaks to your point, Tal, a little bit, your question of like, what's the right political response here? Well, it goes back to those principles. So let's not stimulate markets, let's free them. As I said, I'm a professional investor. I was thinking about it, literally stared at these monitors every day for 20 years. I actually started in the 90s trading commodities on the floor. So I have a little bit of experience way back when, screaming and yelling on the floor of the exchanges. I'm also an analyst on Fox News Channel, so you might have seen me in various ages and states over the years talking about a lot of these issues. I'm also the editor of a new book called A New Textbook of Americanism. I was able to speak with about this when I was at the Freedom Conference last time, and hats off to Boaz, who has, amazingly published this in Hebrew as well. So check out Boaz's websites and my website as well. It's capitalistbig.com to get it in Hebrew as well as English. So where are we in my estimation? Well, look, reality exists. And COVID-19 is a stunning public health crisis. We really have never seen anything like this before. You can't solve it by ignoring it. And from what I've seen, it's obviously a huge economic crisis as well. Just look at this morning's print of jobless claims going back to the late 1960s. And this is, I don't know, Viron is truly the finance expert, Six Sigma type of event. You've really never seen this type of a tremendous shock to the economy in modern times. And it's the same thing around the world in Israel. I mean, Israeli unemployment numbers, I believe, were 4%. 2 months ago, now 23% unemployment in Israel. So this is shocking. The response, and I believe our response as advocates for liberty in whatever context, needs to be for freedom, freedom in every context, because we know we're not just dogmatic ideologues, and you hear that oftentimes. No, it's not the time for ideas. We need action. But it's the ideas, and it's specifically only the free human mind that can produce whatever the values that we need. Whatever we need has to be produced by people's minds, people's reasons. And this comes down to health, medical equipment. I mean, your Brooke on his broadcast and even today talked about, look, if we need ways to solve some of these issues with the lack of supply in medical equipment, But it's also bigger picture, the economy. I mean, the only way the economy can recover, the only way any economy can prosper is through that economic freedom. But you know, what has been the response? Freedom? No. Anything but. It's been from the get-go, inevitably, with some few exceptions. There's some minor regulatory loosening of regulations here in the States. It's been more government controls. Probably most notably, the $2 trillion stimulus bill passed, I guess, last week here. By far the biggest bill in U.S. history. But again, this is the same thing, obviously, that's going on in Israel. Not exactly the same. I'm not as familiar with Israel, but more government spending, more government intervention, more government control. And look, Ayn Rand, who I'm a supporter of and a believer of, she famously advocates, she studied history. And if you study some history, you'll find that time and time again, stimulus in all forms hurts the markets, hurts wealth creation, which is what we all want. And it hurts people's lives. At the end of the day, it hurts human life on Earth. And I'm going to give you 3 examples. Again, there's so much to learn about this, but hopefully this inspires you to just get out there to say why, if you really care about human life right now, you're going to advocate for freedom. The one I know best, and I've literally seen this since I was on the floor of the exchange, is trading halts in stock markets. Now, it might seem kind of, I don't know, not that important to you all, like, who cares, so they stop trading, but you've been hearing a lot about it lately, right? Oh, stocks hit a circuit breaker. It fell so far, they were halted again. Circuit breakers are being, and basically the government comes in and says, stocks can only fall 7%, and then they stop trading. You can't trade if it goes. Now they have different staggers along the way, but it's government putting an artificial floor or on either how far markets can fall or how far they can rise over a certain time period. It's kind of ironic. They call it a cooling off period, like traders are gun nuts going to go shoot someone. Like, oh, we have to calm these irrational traders. And it's gotten so bad in Italy, in fact, that they're actually banning short selling. It's been talked about here in the States as well. And even this is not so unusual. There has been talk, it gets worse when the market falls like it did yesterday, 1,000 points in one day. People are saying, hey, look, maybe we need to shut down, have a banking holiday, shut the markets down, everything calm down, let government figure it out, and then we'll let the markets. This is happening all over the place. And what you need to know is that, does it create calm? Does it allow people to be more rational and think? No, it creates terrible, terrible volatility. I mean, this has been studied for decades, but by one estimate on a kind of a seminal scholarly study, essentially creates about 230% more volatility than otherwise the case. And not only the day, then even the day after. So it creates volatility. And look, it makes sense. You don't have to be a scholar to understand why would you bid to buy something when it's down 6%, when if it goes down 7%, you can't get out at all. I tweeted and on Twitter, it's like, tell people the banks are going to close, you will create a panic. Tell people the markets are going to shut, 100 points lower, or that we can't change it. So you're going to create a panic. And we've seen this time and time again. This is just from, I guess, maybe 2 weeks ago. Market starts to fall. This is the S&P. This is the Dow Jones Industrial. Market starts to fall right at the open. Hits the trading halt. Trading is halted for 15 minutes. And then at the end of the day, you've wasted a day, but the market ends up closing exactly where it was. Now, that's not always the case. But the point is that these trading halts are artificial impediments and wealth destruction into the market on a very micro level. They create volatility. All right, now you're saying, okay, what does this mean to me ultimately? Well, just extrapolate that. Extrapolate that pattern of force in wealth creation and price discovery across the entire global economy. And that's what we're seeing now. It's not just volatility, but it's creating tremendous, and it will create tremendous malinvestment. I got a little shit on Fox the other day because I don't know, maybe Stuart Varney said, what do you think of the stimulus program? I said, it's going to create, its size is terrible. He says, it's because it's not big enough. I said, no, because it's way too big. It's going to create tremendous malinvestment. What is malinvestment? It's a waste of money, in effect. It's like burning money and wasting people's time, wasting people's efforts that inevitably leads to economic losses. And this is what intervention on any scale, and certainly this scale, always does. Again, I mean, the history on this is so well documented. These are recessions since World War II. The two worst by far are the ones that there were stimulus checks and ultra low interest rates, all in intervention. In 2001, this was tried. And then most recently in 2007 and 2008, same pattern of make work projects, stimulus, etc. This was a chart that ironically Republicans used to pass around a lot. And it was correct back then. It's correct, back now. The Obama White House was saying, well, we need to spend, hundreds of billions of dollars. Otherwise, unemployment could get as high as 9%. Well, guess what? They spent the hundreds of billions, and unemployment still went to 10%. And the recovery was ultimately a lot longer than it otherwise would have been. You might remember the Chevy Volt. One of the terrible things now that's being discussed in 2020 is government, and it's just chilling to say it, but it's government taking equity stakes in U.S. companies. Now, look, they're just talking about airlines now, which is terrible to begin with, but I watch prices all day long, and I don't think it's ultimately just going to be airlines. I think it's most likely going to be insurance companies, healthcare providers, and banks as well. But Obama basically bragged that, and the Chevy Volt, you might remember, was a car that the government minders who owned GM at the time, who were managing GM at the time, they spearheaded it. Well, it was malinvestment. I mean, GM was losing 50 grand on every Volt that they sold. So what was the point of it? And of course, ultimately they pulled the plug on it as well. And the taxpayer and writ large growth was the victim. We're seeing the same malinvestment today. History is repeating ourselves. This is, look, from March, this is a headline from yesterday, 2 days ago. All this malinvestment is creating confusion in American Airlines. You have American Airlines now, U.S. Airlines. In fact, Trump was asked about this yesterday. What about these empty planes that are flying? They're flying because the stimulus package, the rescue package, requires them to preserve the service capacity, right? Got to keep those jobs, got to keep people working. So they're burning through money even faster than they otherwise would if they have not been evading reality by a, quote, stimulus package. So we're seeing that malinvestment even now. It's like it's just started and we're already seeing money literally burn. And more important, people's time being wasted when it could be spent on moving on to something productive. Same thing now. Here's something being cooked up here in the U.S. Ultra low interest rate loans to basically keep people employed, not given by a bank, of course, given by the government. And what the hell kind of a loan is a loan if it can be forgiven? I mean, this isn't a loan. It's like when Obama used to say the healthcare marketplace, it's an insult to marketplaces. A loan that is forgiven if you do with it's not a loan. It's a redistribution of wealth and malinvestment on a grand scale. Seen this before. Herbert Hoover tried all of this back in 1932. Came up and cooked up with a lot of this stimulus program. Before Roosevelt's great New Deal, it was Herbert Hoover essentially tried it out. And look, Trump is doing exactly the same thing. Point after point after point after point. Mortgage subsidies, pressuring people to hold off on layoffs, big public works projects. Trump's cooked up a $1 zillion stimulus bill, to put people on the job. So we're making the same mistakes again. Creates that malinvestment. All right. Again, we could do hours on that. The third point I want to really briefly make is that it creates stagnation. Dr. Brooke, I think, said it exactly right, that, Venezuela, it's kind of like become, I'm breaking my own rule by even saying the name, but like the Hitler thing, like, oh, it's as bad as Hitler, that's so easy. And saying something is as bad as Venezuela is also pretty easy because Venezuela is terrible, but it's not the only potential outcome of this type of intervention in the economy. I think Japan probably provides a much more realistic and, I don't know, say equally horrifying, but certainly horrifying potential. Japan has been stimulating. This chart only goes up to 08. You can tack on another 12 years. They have been stimulating for decades. Mega stimulus in Japan. And what's been the net result? Stagnant wages, stagnant GDP, falling even further behind the US, certainly than its competitors in the modern world. The stock market is still well below its 1989 peak in Japan. And real estate prices, we've got to prop up those mortgage, keep down mortgage rates, got to keep real estate prices high. I mean, even now, 31 years after, real estate prices have still not rebounded to that peak level. So the whole point of having markets, I think, at least my POV these days, is that they have to reflect reality, not government control. The whole point of having a market, unless you're just pretending it, the whole point is they're only useful unless they're reflecting reality. And all this intervention is creating volatility. It's creating malinvestment. It's creating the stagnation. So this is now more than ever we need to advocate for free markets because, as I said, only the human mind can produce the values needed to solve the health and economic dislocation that exists. COVID is a reality, but we can solve it as creative entrepreneurs in all of our unique contexts. Now more than ever, government needs to get out of the way. And we're seeing it. I mean, this has just essentially started a couple of days ago, but this notion of dining bonds, you can essentially buy $100 worth of your favorite restaurant, give them $75 today, and in a year, whatever it is, it's a discounted gift certificate. You can support it. It's a way I love it. It's kind of securitizing restaurants and being able to support them at the same time. Here in Chicago, one of the world's most well-known restaurants, look, they have bills to pay as well. Alinea is all of a sudden doing to-go orders. These are menus that usually cost $300 a person. They're figuring out a way to do it, at low cost, keeping some of their people employed, keeping some of life moving on. And of course, on a much more kind of practical level, look what Dyson is doing. These are the geniuses who are saving our lives. Don't make them sit at home watching YouTube videos. Let them figure it out. Let them take the risks. Let companies retool. And that's the only thing that ultimately is going to save us and can save us if a government gets out of the way. So crisis, as I said, and as Tom said, I think so eloquently, it's not when we should abandon principles. Really is when we need principles the most. And I applaud all of you all over the world who are joining us these days because you're truly part of the solution in advocating for these ideas, especially now. Now, I'll say one more thing. Steve Jobs famously always had one more thing. I did promise a stock pick or two in my promo video, so I'm going to get to that. But first, I just want to thank you all before I switch back to my own photo and just thank you all, especially our sponsors for including me today.
We do have some questions, Jonathan. We have some questions. Boaz is sending me questions from the audience, but I wanted to follow up on what you presented because you mentioned Hoover, you mentioned Roosevelt and the New Deal, but people around the world are now wondering, they say the huge 2008 bailouts and money printing following the financial crisis never caused inflation. So why wouldn't we just write the same successful prescription again and save the economy?
I just challenge all those assumptions. It didn't cause inflation, but it did cause, and this was kind of a common rallying cry of a lot of so-called fiscal conservatives. They're absent in America now these days, but it did cause the most moribund recovery in modern history. It was really only in the last 6 months that you started to see any of those traditional measures of, it was pointed out, the recovery through the Obama stimulus recovery was slower than oftentimes growth during the Carter administration in the 1970s, 1% and 2% growth, and all that expenditure, which was only checked, thankfully, to the opposition of a lot of Republicans who demanded the sequester bill at the time. So people chalk up the bailout of GM and all the money spending and the money printing at that time as a success. But they don't see the unforeseen consequences that you always see as a result, most notably just a terribly moribund economy for a decade or more.
And I want to go back again to the New Deal because it's something that we keep hearing in Israel. Some lawmakers have brought us up over the last 2 weeks. I think Ofer Shelach from the Blue and White Party was one of them. They bring it as an example of how the U.S. government saved the economy after the 1929 crisis. How come these narratives are so wrong and yet they prevail?
Well, I think some of it is, I think ultimately it's philosophic. When you say someone's going to lose their job, people are losing their jobs, and this is why I think ultimately it's a philosophical battle, is that people's response is government has to do something. We have to do something. Government has to step in and do something. People are losing their jobs. And well, we can't have Trump especially, and many Americans talk in this nationalistic tone. We have to have an airline industry. We have to have a steel industry. And again, it's abandoning those principles. One element of history that is quite helpful, Tal, is people might not remember before the Great Depression that began, essentially after the stock market crash and when all that intervention began, there was a less than year depression in 1920 that no one even talks about. And it wasn't Herbert Hoover, it was William Harding, who did exactly the opposite of everything that's being advocated economically today. He slashed taxes, he cut federal spending, the government did not lower interest rates, the Federal Reserve did not lower interest rates to stimulate the economy, and unemployment went, I believe, from 12% to 2% within a year and a half, within 2 years, the economy. So it's called here in the U.S. the forgotten depression. So the history has been completely told wrong. It's a government saved the economy in 2008, and what's underlying that ignorance, I think, is that altruism, because the sense is, well, we just can't leave people free. What would happen? People, and it denigrates the creative entrepreneur and also the benevolent individual who would help people who they cared about, who were honestly in need in times like this.
Jonathan, I want to stop you right there because I want to take it to Europe right now, back to Fleming for a second, because we talked a lot about what's happening in Israel and the stimulus package that they're debating now. They're also struggling to form a government in Israel. That's a whole different aspect. But Fleming, what is being done or debated in regards to saving the economy where you are now, in Denmark? Or I mean, Sweden is in a different situation right now because their economy is still somewhat alive. But what are you hearing there?
Well, I think that in Europe, most governments are shutting down businesses because we are in an emergency situation. I agree with that. That in fact, people are being harmed if they are being infected by people who are infected by the virus, and therefore it's legitimate to restrict some freedoms in this situation. But the price for the economy is enormous. And as in the US, European governments are stepping in with huge money packages. And my concern is that the vast majority of private business in Europe will be dependent on the government for years, if not decades to come. Because who is going to finance this lockdown of the economy? Taxpayers. So I'm pretty sure that in the aftermath of this lockdown, when the economy starts to run again, taxes will be increased, and it will have a negative effect on wealth creation in Europe as well.
Mm-hmm. I'm hearing that Yaron Brook is back with us. So Yaron, we want to take it to you because you've been listening in. We talked about the 2008 bailouts, the New Deal, the stimulus package, and now in Israel, by the way, they're talking, I think, about 80 billion shekel, which are around $22 billion size of a stimulus package. Quite controversial. Yaron, you're with us?
Yeah, I mean, 22 billion is like, chump change given what we're doing in the United States. $2.2 trillion stimulus package. Look, the history of economics is taught in distorted and perverted ways. The fact is that the New Deal, unemployment when FDR took over in 1932, or January 1933, was just as high in 1938 as when it was in 1933. All of the stimulus and job programs and all of the things that he supposedly saved the United States, they did nothing. They perpetuated a depression. The United States didn't exit the Great Depression until the end of World War II, until 1945, when government spending declined, regulations declined, and went back to a very semi-free market. 2008, people talk about the stimulus and the Fed and Bernanke and Paulson. I mean, much of the 2008 crisis, in my view and in the view of many economists, was caused by the panic and just a sense of that the people running things had no clue what they were doing, that politicians were messing things up. So a lot of what happened in 2008 was caused by politics and the Fed. And then the outcome was slow economic growth for 10 years. Pathetic economic growth. I mean, Trump likes to hail his economy as the best ever. But with all due respect, 2% economic growth is, you don't write home about 2%. 2% is really, really weak. And so we had 10 years of very slow economic growth. And one could argue the growing of bubbles and growing of malinvestment and misallocation of capital, that the crisis now is worse, I think, in markets and elsewhere because of all the things that were done under the Obama administration and during the 08-09 crisis by the Fed. So these things build on one another. In many respects, the 08 crisis, I mean, we don't have time to go into this now, but in many respects, the 08 crisis is a consequence of the security regulations that FDR passed in 33 and 34 during the Great Depression. These things, these government interventions come back to bite us, sometimes decades later. But the fact is, markets work. And if we left markets free, if we left markets alone, yes, there's sometimes down phases. Yes, there's certain times where governments needs to step in to help, like with the coronavirus, to help maybe isolate certain groups of people and maybe have emergency measures for short periods of time to test and to isolate the people who actually carry the virus. But there is no excuse for the government to be interfering in the economy, to shut down businesses on a massive scale with no end date, and to suggest that it can cure the problems that it itself creates. It can't. It creates greater problems every time it intervenes.
Mm-hmm. I want to take some questions from the audience. Boaz is sending me your questions, everyone. We really appreciate your engagement here. Ben Bloom is asking, do people support economic war against China? Isn't the global economic system too dependent on Chinese goods, which makes situations like the coronavirus more dangerous?
What does economic war even mean? I mean, it is a terrible analogy. War is when you blow up stuff and you destroy. Trade is a win-win relationship. Trade is a relationship from which you benefit. Now, China has problems, and we should call China on those problems, and we should acknowledge those problems, and we should use the bully pulpit to condemn Chinese authoritarianism and Chinese oppression and and misinformation and what they did during this crisis. But, if we had zero tariffs now in the United States right now, then as our economy is declining, the Chinese economy slowly is getting revived. Mexico hasn't really had much of an economic shutdown. We could be trading with them. We could be benefiting from the fact that they're producing. We could be consuming the things that they are making right now, and indeed we are, right? There still is, to a large extent, trade going on. But what we should be doing as a consequence of this is two things: increasing trade, lowering barriers, lowering tariffs, and at the same time, morally condemning bad behavior, morally condemning authoritarian regimes when they act in authoritarian ways. And China, there's plenty to condemn. There's plenty to go after. You know, Fleming talked about civil liberties. Civil liberties don't, to a large extent, don't exist anymore in China. They've been in decline over the last 5 years. I mean, they never were great to begin with, but certainly over the last 4 or 5 years, they've been seriously in decline, and they're at a low. They're getting closer and returning to the days of you know, totalitarianism. And we need to condemn that. But I think stopping trading with them would be a massive mistake, both for us and for the prospects of liberty within China.
And if I can jump in, I think that is the key issue. I mean, I don't think people are talking so much about economic war, but there are voices calling for decoupling with China. Isn't that the same, Yaron? I mean, that the U.S. economy shouldn't be dependent on Chinese supply chains when it comes to pharmaceuticals and other, you know, key products. I think that's what some national security people are calling for. Would you be against that?
Is Yaron, can you hear Fleming? I'm not so sure. Let me take it to Tom for a second, because I cannot hear Yaron. We'll circle back to it a bit later. Tom, you're with me, right?
I am indeed.
All right, so yeah, take it.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to ask you this, because in Israel, it's been reported time and again over recent weeks that President Trump, he seems to be disconnected from the reality on the ground in his own country. I heard this sentence repeated so many times by Israeli media. And there's also, I have to tell you, as an Israeli expat living here in the U.S., there's a sense among Israelis of, whoa, we're so much ahead of America in fighting this pandemic, as if it's a competition, you know, between countries. And who has a greater stimulus package, and who will give, you know, which government is going to give more money to their own people, you know, to withstand this crisis. But I've seen polls here in the U.S. showing that the president is actually gaining support these days, and that's what I want you maybe to explain. There's a Gallup poll that showed that 60% of Americans approve of Trump's handling of the coronavirus crisis. And on Friday, I think President Trump's approval rating hit 45.8%, which is the highest since January 2017. So what are you reading into this?
I think that the explanation there is psychological and not economic or political. In a crisis, people want to run and stand behind daddy's legs. And Trump, despite the grotesque incompetence of the government response here, authentically grotesque, the misinformation, the outright lies that have to be walked back by all the experts afterward, he stands there and talks to people every day. And so it's like hearing daddy say, things are okay, I have it under control. This is a natural and normal response. The crises, the perception of a threat, generates what Karen Stenner, the political psychologist, called authoritarian groupiness, collectivism, and the desire for the man on the white horse, or in this case, the big daddy, to save us. Give him more power and he'll save us. I think that's what's happening. The objective record, going back to Jonathan Honig's point about reality, has been incompetence, simple incompetence on the part of our government. And I should add one more thing. Jonathan Honig's wisdom is scarcer than hand sanitizer in the United States right now. Very difficult to find people who will speak this way, because the Republicans have signed up with Trumpy authoritarian collectivism, nationalism, scapegoating of minorities. I personally find it quite hateful when they talk about the Chinese virus, as if the virus had some nationality, and I think that fuels hatred of Asian Americans, which we've seen some evidence of, including in London, Chinese descended people being beaten up savagely on the street by nationalists. So I think the Trump administration has been grossly incompetent. Unfortunately, the other side of the spectrum said, my God, if only we'd have even more government, and if Trump had only had more power, everything would be okay. And the example is the fact that the federal government forbade private testing companies from producing tests. It was illegal. FDA and CDC sent out orders, don't test people. We have it under control. They forbade them to use tests that had already been approved by World Health Organization, were available January 10 in South Korea and in Germany. They had private labs already producing them. They said no. And it was one doctor, Dr. Helen Chu, she's a hero in my book, in Seattle, who said, you know, the hell with you. We have people dying here. We don't know exactly why. I'm going to get one of these tests, not the faulty ones the government produced that didn't work, by the way. I'm going to get one of these ones that works, and I'm going to test people, and she proved it. So what they're saying now is, oh, God, the other side says, if only more government had been there to cut through the bureaucratic red tape and obstacles created by the rest of the government. I think that's madness. What we needed was to get rid of those crazy controls in the first place. So one point to watch for on social media, the Competitive Enterprise Institute has been putting out the hashtag never needed. These restrictions were never needed. We should get rid of them. Yes, cut through the bureaucracy, but get rid of them. There are 4 federal agencies that regulate respirators in the United States. Well, gosh, it's amazing. It's difficult to get them. One fashion designer in New York had to get a permission tweet from the governor of New York, a personal permission to be able to convert his dressmaking shop into producing face masks because it was illegal. They couldn't do that. So the governor had to say, I give you my blessing. I personally will tweet unto thee the right to save lives. This has got to go.
Can I just, first let me apologize for the terrible internet here in Puerto Rico that keeps knocking me out. I agree completely with Tom. Tom, what Tom just said is absolutely right. Look, at times of crisis, people like to rally not just around daddy, but around the flag. And particularly in this time of tribalism and collectivism, which is on the rise in America, which is on the rise all over the world, people like to rally around a strong leader who seems to know what he's doing, which is dubious about Trump, right? But at least speaks and commands authority. And that, I think, explains what's happening with Trump's approval rating. But think about it this way. When after 9/11, George W. Bush, who I think responded in pretty pathetic way to 9/11, approval rating jumped up to 95%. 95. So 60% in a time of an emergency is not that high, right? It's not a particularly high given the tendency of people to rush towards anybody who seems to be strong. I mean, look at the Democrats rallying around Andrew Cuomo because he seems presidential, because Andrew Cuomo seems like a strong leader. This is a sad tendency that we all have. And again, I think the consequence of that is we give too much power to politicians during these times, and we never get it back. We never get those freedoms back. And indeed, all the deregulation that we've heard that's going on in America today, it's not going to last, unfortunately.
Tom, there's one thing we haven't talked about so far today, and that's the health system. We have so many people tuning in, listening to us, Viron, Tom, and Jonathan, and Fleming, from all around the world. We have people from Israel, and we have people from Europe, many also here in America. But you know that many people outside the United States, and this is something that I found out since having moved here, are under the impression that the U.S. health system is some sort of a beacon of free market. And I've seen many posts on social media of people praising their country's universal healthcare systems as if the corona crisis is going to make the argument once and for all against private healthcare. So here's my question to you, gentlemen. How do you explain to people that the U.S. health system is not really so much what they might have had in mind? Tom, would you like to take it?
Let me just jump off. I think we should look around the world for solutions that have worked. And the South Koreans, not say everything in South Korea is wonderful, but they had the right response to this going back to 2015 when they had their MERS outbreak. They said, oh my God, we have to enable and free private enterprise to respond to these things. And they were very quick out of the box because they did not box up private enterprise. The U.S. has a command and control system. We don't allow something that many countries do allow, which is if a drug has passed some tests in Israel or Germany or Australia, why should it have to go through the same tests for 7 years in the U.S.? It doesn't make any sense. So there's no reciprocity in the United States, and that's something we should do. And many other countries have done that, but the U.S. has a highly protectionist system that we don't allow those drugs or medical devices to be imported from abroad. It's very restricted. The other element, of course, is there's a great deal of crazy controls and massive amounts of money washing in that makes it makes it almost impossible to have a market in many services. There are no prices. Go to a doctor in America or a hospital and say, oh, that's interesting. How much will that cost? I've had that experience. I say, what do you mean? I said, how much will it cost? I don't know. You'll just get the bill.
Yep.
Well, that's not a market if you can't engage in looking for prices like a consumer. That's crazy. So you have third-party payment systems, which is locked in by our tax code, goes back to World War II. So everyone, because your medical care is a non-taxable benefit, you get it from your employer. Well, the consequence is you're limited in job change. It has negative impacts on the labor market. And in addition, in effect, what you're getting is prepaid medical care rather than actual insurance. So if you look at real insurance markets, prices tend to go down. But we have almost no health insurance. It's actually just prepaid medical care. Well, think about that in any other service. Imagine you had prepaid automobile care. Well, take your car in all the time. The bills will go up and up and up. It's not insurance in the United States. It's a prepaid system. Then in addition, you can't have competition across state lines. Well, that would be anarchy. Oh my God, that someone in New Jersey could buy medical insurance available in Pennsylvania, which is, well, or even just the next state. That's illegal. That's strictly forbidden. So on and on, there's a cascade of regulations and controls that has the effect of driving up the price of medical care. Now, there are some advantages in the American system. It's not all bad. It's not the Soviet Union, but it is definitely not laissez-faire. And in some regards, it's less of a free market than some European countries have.
So let's ask Europe. Let's go to Europe. Fleming, just give us a sense if you can compare, for example, I know the Swedish health system has its own problems, and maybe that should be the question asked. Is there even an ideal health system in the world? Even in routine times, it's not uncommon for ambulances in Japan to cruise the streets, right, to find an emergency room that could take in a patient. You have Canadians complaining about wait time for healthcare. Nurses work 24-hour shifts. There's a lack of beds in certain hospitals. The Swedish system suffers similar problems despite a government spending which is the third highest in the European Union. And if we talk about the British NHS, then I mean we shouldn't even get started. So what is really the vision of the ideal healthcare system, one that can better deal with a pandemic?
I think just to give a little historical perspective, I mean, the European welfare state has been challenged within, the past 10, 20 years. And in fact, some things have been outsourced to private enterprises. But just to give you one funny example from Denmark, that might be telling, when the Danish healthcare system wasn't prepared for this as well, but and they lacked respirators. But it turned out that a private hospital in Denmark had a lot of these respirators, and the government said, "Well, okay, we need them, so we're going to take them away from you." But I think. I mean, I agree with Tom on the state of the healthcare system in the US and the incompetence of government. And in Europe, the narrative is very much that the US is a disaster at the moment. But I think we in Europe underestimate the strength of civil society in America. And I think that the US will come back in spite of the government. And due to this reality of self-organization around local communities. In Europe, unfortunately, most people sit and wait for the government. That's not the case in the US. People take their fate in their own hands, and they start, initiating things and circumventing the government. And therefore, I'm pretty confident that at the end of the day, my big concern, I have a bigger concern regarding Europe than the US. While at the moment it looks the other way around.
Tal, I'll briefly jump in. I mean, to absolutely discredit that false claim, as you said, that people for some reason believe that there's any semblance of a free market in healthcare in America is like ludicrous on its face. I mean, there's explicit socialized healthcare for people, I believe, older than 65 with Medicare. But even before Obamacare was passed 10 years ago, even then, government already paid for, I believe, 50% of all healthcare expenditures. So, just like in 2008, they said, "Oh, it was free market economics that crashed the economy." That same fallacy is being promoted today. And Fleming, it's great to see you, by the way. I'm such a fan and just appreciative of all that you've done over the years. I wish I had your confidence, frankly, about Americans, because there does seem to be that sense of, well, government's got to figure it out. And, as Tom and others have mentioned, there's losses that perspective of how can a creative minds figure this in the absence of coercion? I mean, maybe now, for example, Apple, who famously has sat on, all these billions of dollars for years, who knows, maybe they can open up for-profit exclusive boutique-only hospitals. Maybe they roll up these boutique doctors that have been popping up. Maybe you pay, $10,000 a month, and it's very expensive to start. They figure it out. The only way we can get any type of wealth created is by those creative individual minds. But the feeling now is like, well, we've got to have government to fix us, and that's leading us down the wrong path.
Yaron, is there an ideal healthcare system? I don't, maybe, is there Yaron? Maybe that should be my question. All right. Let me continue, and I'll go to Tom here. You know what I found very interesting, gentlemen, how in recent weeks, supporters of almost every ideology that we know, they feel as if the corona crisis is emboldening their initial beliefs, meaning green activists believe that it's a wake-up call from Mother Earth. Socialists believe that the pandemic is the ultimate proof of why we need a universal health system. Maybe that's the reason why Bernie is, by the way, still in the race. Maybe it will generate some momentum at the end of it. We don't know. And then you have conservatives that are now saying, we told you so about the national debt. What do you think should be our main takeaway once this wave of pandemic is over? What should this experience teach us for the future? Well, let's do it around here. Jonathan, we'll start with you.
Well, I mean, you're absolutely right. You left off actually the mystics, the religious people who are saying, well, this is God getting us, God is paying us back for living, a sinful life. So, it harkens back, Tal, to a famous quote of a Democrat, a famous Democratic leader here in the States, Democratic Big D, the Democratic Party. Rahm Emanuel happens to be a Jewish guy, but famously said, never let a crisis go to waste. So, of course, they're all taking advantage of this crisis to push their own agenda. Dr. Brooke, I think, has theorized, and I think he's right, that this is going to hasten the explicit nationalization of healthcare in America. Certainly going to explicitly hasten fascism in terms of government holding policies. And I think the only way to do it is to stress the practicality of free markets and stress the history, which demonstrates every time this type of intervention has been tried, it's failed on its face.
Let's continue this round. Tom, what do you think this experience should teach us for the future? What should be the takeaway? How do you see it?
Well, there are a number of points that I think we should keep in mind. One thing, I put in a link on the chat box to a very nice, very useful article by Gonzalo Schwartz on human ingenuity and calling on that to solve this problem. So I encourage people to look at that and read it. It has a lot of good information in it. Second thing is that we have to remind people that when you need more ventilators, you have to get someone to make them, or respirators, or whatever it happens to be. And that means enterprise. Waving a magic wand doesn't create more of them. So we need to have enterprise that's free to do that. There is I don't want to use the term silver lining, but there are some lessons here that we need to hammer home and do it in a responsible and thoughtful way, not sounding like outside critics or carpers. And that is that these restrictions on the implementation of medical devices should never have been there. The United States, take a very simple example, has certificate of need requirements. They deliberately restricted the number of ventilators in communities, because if you wanted to install one, you have to get a certificate of need approval from the government. And who gets to comment on it and veto it? It's other owners of ventilators. It's just a cartel. And that has restricted the ability of the market to respond, because you have to go to this cumbersome procedure and may be told no. Get rid of those things. There's no reason to stop people from implementing or bringing about new services in the market and being responsive. So I think there are some things that we need to learn from this, and there are points that can be made in a non-ideological way. You don't have to sound like an ideologue to say, look, did that make sense? We deliberately restricted the numbers of clinics and deliberately restricted the number of ventilators. Why don't we just get rid of that? And if someone wants to install a ventilator in a clinic, they shouldn't have to ask permission of all of their competitors before doing so. That's the reality of the American healthcare system. We need to get rid of it. And finally, we do remind people that it's just silly mysticism, frankly, to think, oh, there wouldn't have been a pandemic if we had universal health care of the sort they have in, Italy. Yes, that's the country. Bernie Sanders wants the Italian system, and they got the pandemic too. I'm not going to claim they got the pandemic because of the medical system. They got it because of a virus. But the idea that implementing the Italian medical system in other countries will prevent pandemics it's laughable. In a very sad way. I don't like to laugh about this, but it's absurd.
Sure. Or deal better with a pandemic once the outbreak is there. Yaron, I hear you're back with us. Your thoughts here? Yaron? I'm not sure. So Yaron is popping back and forth, I don't know, from this conversation. I think his internet is up and down. Oh, you see him? Jonathan, if not, I have a question here for you.
Let's try it.
Okay, so let's take it. Boa sent me this question. I don't know who sent it. Here we go. Since the dollar is tied to gold, and in the last, 10 years, there has been doubts if the Federal Reserve has any gold left, then money is not worth anything except for what people believe it's worth. So isn't stimulus, isn't maybe the stimulus package coming to make people believe things are okay, the only thing that can in reality be done? Do you get the question here?
Yeah, I think I get the element of it, and it kind of goes back to a lot of our point. And our point here is that the stimulus supposedly
malinvestment.
Yeah, malinvestment, and also it creates an uncertainty That otherwise, I mean, look, if you went to the doctor, you would want the doctor to tell you exactly what's going on. That's what prices and markets do. But, you know, the stimulus, so can you trust prices in the marketplace now? You don't know, is it a real price? Is it a result of the stimulus and all the intervention? And the same thing that goes with the value of all these prices. You know, I'm looking even on my screen here, I mean, the value of corporate bonds in the last 3 weeks has vacillated, I don't know, by 20-something%. That type of volatility only exists when government starts getting involved, because people have to think, well, now I'm not just looking at it as blowing a good risk, but like, well, what about the stimulus? And it drives up that volatility and it drives out that liquidity. So it has just that opposite impact when it comes to trying to calm markets and create calm.
Jonathan, we've seen stocks plummeting in recent weeks. First, tell us, where's all the money going to?
Well, I prepared a few ideas of where I'm investing and what I'm looking at. I'll share briefly if you want. I mean, not explicit recommendations, but you know, I did have these stunning matches printed up with a quote from Ayn Rand. I think is pretty important now.
The smallest minority are now. Yeah, read it.
Well, one idea is just cash. Tal, cash I think is important now. I mean, unfortunately, government intervention prompts you to be short-term thinking. But if you've ever wanted a day trade, I'll previously say these are markets that are great for day trading, but the intervention itself makes it very difficult to have any type of long-term perspective because they're literally coming up with the stimulus, the volatility on a day-by-day basis. I'll give you another idea. I'm looking at a BDRY. This is an ETF that tracks shipping rates. To Yaron Brooks' point, I mean, shipping from China and all around the world, it is a lifeline to any economy, especially the U.S. economy. Those shipping rates have been decimated as a result of this crisis. Obviously, I think that they'll bounce back. I think we can't bounce back unless they bounce back. So I'm looking at that as well. And one more I'll put on the list as well. I don't want to monopolize it, but the reveal there is PPLT. This is an ETF that tracks platinum prices. Platinum is a severely depressed. And Tal, I'm worried about an environment, you know, that frankly you saw during the 1970s. You've saw it since the 1990s in Japan, where hoarding essentially starts to become an economic reality. This is an asset that potentially could hedge against that. As always, do your own due diligence. But here are some ways that I'm trying to protect myself and maybe make some money.
Another question that I have here, what do you think about cryptocurrencies?
You know, I'm not involved in crypto as well. To me, it's trading like any other risk asset. I mean, again, I'm not, people get very passionate about crypto. It's performed very poorly as of lately. In my sense, is crypto, honestly, is an asset that was born as a result of the government intervention that Dr. Brooke and Tom have alluded to. Only with those ultra low interest rates, you know, could you create a multi-billion-dollar asset class that's essentially based on nothing and has no practical use, at least at this point. So I'm skeptical of crypto and can't say that I'm involved in it at this time.
All right, one more question to you, Jonathan, that I have here from the chat. I understand you are opposed to government offering stimulus to companies in times like this. Do you suggest leaving companies and economies to collapse? Isn't it better to offer stimulus packages based? I don't understand the rest of it, but
sure. You don't want to have you don't have companies. You know, it's like you know, there's far better economists on this line. I don't want to monopolize, but to me, trader and as a student of objectivism, it goes back to that idea of it's pretty evil to evade reality. So if a company is bought back its stock with borrowed money and bought back its stock, if no one's flying, it's pretty evil to evade reality and say they're not going to have to make some changes to their employment, for example. But there's this tremendous fear, Tal, about what if a company goes bankrupt? Look, American, Delta, and United have all been bankrupt within the last 20 years. Planes kept flying, stockholders lose money, and bondholders, oftentimes a little more wise and haven't seen what happened to the company, take over. So that's what always can't be seen. You know, von Mises and others, Henry Hazlitt, have talked about economics as a second and third level consequences. That's what's all about. So if, for example, you could see that regulation taken away, I mean, what if in the next 5 years you had Microsoft, Apple, Costco, and Walmart all getting into the hospital game, into the healthcare game? Maybe, as I said, it's like a subscription model, like a gym. Amazon
was talking about it.
It could be something really tremendous, but it's what we can't see, and that's why we need these creative geniuses to get in the game, and that's why government got to get out.
Mm-hmm. Tom, let's bring you in.
I should make a quick point that about stimulus versus liquidity in the market and having the banking system respond, and then in addition, an insurance policy. We really don't need stimulus. This is a supply problem. It's not collapsing demand or liquidating previous malinvestments. This is a supply shock. People are not able to produce wealth. It's the effective wealth that creates demand in the economy. The problem is people can't work. That's the problem. Now, there is an issue involved in this. You think about friends of mine who are now out of work. What's going to happen if they can't pay their rent? And if this goes on for 3 more months? I do think that it is reasonable to say government may be an insurer of last resort in such circumstances. But don't fool yourself into calling it stimulus. We don't want people to go out and buy more stuff in the stores. The whole point is that kind of behavior should be limited to limit the spread of a contagious disease, a public health problem. But I don't think it's unreasonable to say that those people who are on hourly jobs, that suddenly they can't work, they're in the service industry, oops, I'm getting a feedback.
An echo, yeah. It echoes.
That they should not be able to support themselves. So call it that, deal with that as an emergency measure, but it isn't stimulus. That's not what the economy needs. And the example that Jonathan gave, which I heard on the radio this morning, of the airplanes flying an entire jet with 2 passengers and 7 crew members, all so that they can continue to get the money. Doesn't make any sense. We're just throwing wealth away. If you say, look, if you close down, the government will help to provide funding that comes at the expense of all of us to make sure we don't end up with 25% of the population unable to support themselves. I understand that, and that point should be made in that fashion, but not as a stimulus that just doesn't make any sense. It's incoherent.
No, there are certain restrictions on what companies can do with the money they receive from the government as part of the relief bill. What's the reasoning behind that? And do you think it's really necessary? I know they can't buy their own stock, and if you pay a certain amount from the money that you're receiving, it goes directly to pay your workers, then it counts as not as a loan, right? It counts just as money given by the government.
To whom are you directing that?
Take it, Tom.
Well, I think
it's yours.
The big danger here is it is coming with all kinds of controls. And Jonathan mentioned, first off, requiring airplanes to fly empty and burn up fuel. This doesn't make any sense. It's a traditional Washington, D.C. stupidity. But then the other element is that Steve Mnuchin announced they're going to look into buying them. This is extremely dangerous. If what you say is, as insurer of last resort, we're going to enable the payment of wages at some percentage for people who currently are saying, we can't feed our kids right now because the whole economy shut down, it's a cost that will be borne by all of us. But to then say, oh, in exchange, we get to own all these private firms, that's just a catastrophe. And we really have to draw the line at that in a very robust way. We don't want government to end up buying all of these companies in America. It's a horror. And I keep telling my left-wing friends, who are demanding this. Do you really want Donald Trump, this person you hate and have demonized so much, to own all of those companies? This would be disastrous. And I think that we need to pitch that and say, do you want that to happen? And some of them have said, oh, yeah, I hadn't thought of that, because they don't understand government isn't the celestial deity. It's just a bunch of people. It's just a bunch of people. And we don't want those people to have that kind of control over our lives.
Yeah, quickly jump in if I could, Tom. I mean, like in the States, it's very common to kind of make fun of the post office, whose service is inevitably terrible when compared to private market alternatives like FedEx and UPS. And I'd literally be scared for my life getting into an airline owned by, even partially by the federal government. Tal, again, we talked about unintended consequences. You know, are smart young engineers, CEOs, going to want to go work for a company where CEO pay is limited? Are they going to attract the best talent? It is a long-term prescription for disaster for any type of recovery, kind of re-echoing our themes here about this notion of I'm here from the government, I'm here to help, inevitably has a disastrous result when it comes to people's lives and the economy writ large.
Jonathan, I have another question here for you. It says, how fast will the dollar lose its value? Is it possible the dollar will rise first because a lot of borrowing was done in dollars?
Well, again, it's difficult to know because you've got like waves of stimulus crashing into all these other. Dr. Brook has made the point, and I actually think of him, and Fleming actually alluded to a little bit, essentially saying, you know, if you're dollar's going to decline ultimately relative to what? I mean, is it going to decline relative to the euro? No offense to our many European viewers, but would you rather hold dollars still? The U.S. is still relatively more free, much less entitlement state. Perhaps could decline relative to gold, but you know, it doesn't have to be that apocalyptic dollar collapse to make for a very difficult and very weak economy that ultimately hits you a lot more. But I'll say, I mean, if you want to bet on that, if you want to invest on that, there's an ETF, which is UDN, it's Umbrella David Nancy, that goes up as the value of the dollar goes down. Again, not an investment recommendation, but if you think that that's what's going to happen, that's how to play it in your portfolio.
Okay, Iran's internet is not stabilized yet.
Is it really worth the tax break, honestly, Iran, to be in Puerto Rico when you can't get a good internet connection? No offense, Iran.
Okay,
well, he has a lagoon. Fleming, let's get you in this. Just a few more words.
To make a comment on what Tom said, I think you're talking about the United States and Israel, and I'm talking a little bit about Europe, but I think the global picture here is that the state is going to play an increasing role in economies around the world as a consequence of what is happening now. And at the same time, the state is also limiting our civil liberties and individual freedoms. And my concern is that Tom has spoken eloquently about the rise of authoritarianism and populism in other parts of the world. And my concern is that the balance will tip in favor of people who are being, fooled to turn security and belonging into ultimate values. I mean, life is dangerous by definition, and we're all running risks every time we exercise our civil liberties. But because of the fear and because of a certain panic, most people believe in this, that this is a life and death issue for our civilization. And I'm really concerned that we are at a historical point now where the balance will start to tip in favor of state powers, not only in our authoritarian regimes, but also in democracies in North America and in Europe. I don't know what your take is on this, Tom.
I have one final question here, and all of you can answer it. If government mandates that businesses must close, shouldn't government have to pay for the damages done to business owners and employees? I mean, we talked about it, but if you can somehow maybe repeat, where do you stand? If it's the government closing, shouldn't government pay? Fleming, you can take it.
I'm not an economist, but I mean, as a matter of common sense, I think, of course. I mean, if the government, we have delegated the power or the right to coercion and violence to the government, and in return, we should receive security and the freedom to exercise our fundamental liberties. So I think government has a responsibility when they make it impossible for us to do our work. They have to step in.
Tom, a few last words from you for today before we wrap it up.
Well, I do think that what Jonathan mentioned about bankruptcy, I mean, even if there were no restrictions, people would be flying less right now. And going bankrupt, I own some shares in airlines. I don't like it. It means I lose my equity share, in effect. It goes to the bondholders, et cetera. But there's a process for that. And stepping in and bailing them out, it's really protecting current shareholders, and then creating government ownership is a catastrophe. So I don't think that all of the losses involved in this should be socialized. I do think that there may be a role for government as insurer of last resort to ensure that people who are operating on the margins, I'm thinking about people like waiters, for example, that they not end up going hungry or being booted out on the street. This would be, I think, a pretty bad consequence politically as well. Think about what that would mean. But I think we should draw a very clear line between that kind of insurer of last resort function and bailing out shareholders, or, God forbid, acquiring government ownership. And last point, there is a march to authoritarianism right now. This is like putting gasoline on the fire as this is happening. And we should expect more collectivism, more baiting and hatred of ethnic and religious minorities around the world. And I want to be very honest, the Jews are usually number 1 or 2 on the go-to list of people to blame for everything. And I anticipate we're going to see more of this. The language about profiteering is the same language we've used in anti-Semitic pogroms in the past. And I honestly am very fearful about the future. I worry that in 100 years, underground hunted dissident intellectuals will be talking about the golden age of lost liberty, 1989 to 2020. And I want to work very hard with our partners all over the globe to make sure that does not happen. This is the time for us to be more committed and stronger than ever.
I was hoping you're going to shift to a more positive tone, because I did not want to close this beautiful discussion on this very somber note that you said before. So guys, thank you so much for this very fascinating conversation. First, I would like to give a huge shout out and thank the Tel Aviv International Salon for helping us in promoting this session. And also thank you, Dr. Yaron Brook, the host of Yaron Brook Show podcast and chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute. Fleming Rose, who joined us from Denmark, a fellow at the Cato Institute. Jonathan Honig, he's the founder of the Capitalist Pig Hedge Fund and a contributor for Fox Business. And also you, Tom Pallmer, senior fellow at the Cato Institute and vice president for international programs at the Atlas Network. We will all do what we can to make sure that your somber prediction, Tom, of the age of liberty won't be gone years from now